Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter, and today I have a huge guest for you. It's Dr. David Buss, a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. He's one of the founders of the field of evolutionary psychology. His primary research focus is on strategies of human mating, and is also the author of many books, including The Evolution of Desire and also the first textbook in evolutionary psychology, which is called Evolutionary Psychology: The New Science of the Mind. So, Dr. Buss, it's really a pleasure to have you on. I'm a big fan. Thank you a lot for accepting the invitation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. It's good chatting with you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I usually don't ask personal questions, but since it is you, I would like to ask you, what first got you drawn into evolutionary theory and then into applying evolutionary theory to human behavior?
Well, that's a complicated question, but I'll give the very quick answer is that I was trained as a personality psychologist. So that's where I got my PhD is in personality psychology. And historically, personality psychology is supposed to be concerned with human nature. You know, what is the nature, the fundamental nature of human nature? And as I went through all the theories and learned about all the theories of human nature, Freud, Adler, Ronk, all the sort of standard theories, all of them seemed maybe to have elements of truth to it that resonated with me, but they all seemed somewhat arbitrary. That is, they lacked a fundamental foundation for why should we believe this theory as opposed to some other theory. And so that search for a solid foundation, a solid scientific foundation on which to build a theory of human nature is what drew me to evolutionary theory to begin with, because evolutionary theory is a causal process that creates animal nature, and humans are animals, and it creates the organs in our bodies, and it creates our brains, and our psychology is housed largely in our brain. And so I was drawn to that. And then also I started reading. I mean, when I started doing this, there wasn't really much, if anything, in evolutionary psychology. There was no field called evolutionary psychology, but I read people like Robert Trivers and Richard Dawkins and other biologists, and thought that I could actually apply some of these principles to my own empirical research on people. And so I started dabbling in it. This is post PhD now. I was an assistant professor at Harvard at the time when I started doing this. And so I sort of put my toe in the water and just started testing a few straightforward predictions based on mate preferences. And when they were supported, I thought, wow, this is cool stuff. I had previously not, I mean, even though I'd published maybe 20 articles before, I'd never before found something that I felt, wow, this is really a theoretical framework that generates predictions. And so one thing led to another, and I realized I didn't know evolutionary theory. I'd never taken a course in it. So I had to really stop reading in psychology for a while and ensconce myself in depth in learning evolutionary theory, it's quite a complicated technical field. I mean, it's simple at some level, but it's also there are a lot of misunderstandings about it, and it's easy for people to get wrong. Anyway, and then the mating work, really, mating has always fascinated me. And you walk down the street, and I listen on conversations as I stroll across my university, and everybody's talking about mating. What was their date? The last weekend, did you sleep with the guy? And so I noticed that everyone seemed to be obsessed with mating. And from an evolutionary perspective, once you learn the theory, everything, not everything, but so much boils down to mating. So, evolutionary theory is not really about survival, or it's about survival only in as much as it leads to reproduction. And so in sexually reproducing species, of which we're one, mating is really the bottleneck. Everything goes through mating. And so we should have a very rich psychology of mating. And if we don't, then the evolutionary framework wouldn't be very useful to us.
Yes, very interesting. And some months ago, I had Dr. Cosmides on the show, and I even released the video with the title "Everything You've Ever Wanted to Know About Evolutionary Psychology," because it was a 3 hour discussion, in fact. But after that, I suddenly realized, oh my God, I never asked her to define evolutionary psychology. So could you please do that for us?
Sure. Evolutionary psychology is simply psychology through the lens of evolutionary theory. So it's a merger of evolutionary theory and modern principles of psychology, many of which are information processing. And this was Leda Cosmides and John Tooby's brilliant integration, is that they were able to theoretically merge, computational logic or information processing with evolutionary theory to produce this cool merger, and realize, I mean, that's what adaptations are, is they're information processors. And so that's sort of a rough sketch of what evolutionary psychology is. And then in my work, so while Leda Cosmides, who, by the way, I met her when I was an assistant professor at Harvard. I was just a brand new professor, and she was a graduate student. And she heard that I was teaching a course in human motivation using an evolutionary perspective. And so she thought, I mean, there was almost nobody else doing that. So she came and knocked on my door. And so I met her, and then she introduced me to John Tooby, her husband, and then eventually Martin Daly and Margot Wilson did a sabbatical year at Harvard, and so I met them. But yeah, I knew Leda and John Tooby before they'd really published anything on evolutionary psychology, but we had discussions about it at that time. And so it was a happy coincidence, if you will. And so we became good friends, and later, joined together at the Center for Advanced Studies and all that. Originally, you were very kind to mention my textbook, which was the first textbook in the field. And originally, we were gonna, me and Leda Cosmides and John Tooby, Martin Daly, and Margot Wilson, the five of us were originally going to write a text on evolutionary psychology. And so we were all together at the Center for Advanced Studies at Stanford, and one thing led to another, and it just never came to fruition. Everyone, was off doing their own thing, and so I ended up doing it alone. So, but informed by discussions and papers by Leda and John and Martin and Margot, and also Don Simons was another key player.
Yes, those are very interesting stories. But to get now into more specific stuff, and because you study human mating in this case, it is the main focus of your work, I think. Could you tell people what are the main basic concepts that come from evolutionary theory and specifically from evolutionary psychology that they would have to know in order to properly understand what are the bases of human mating? So, for example, would you say that we could start with, for example, parental investment theory coupled with paternity uncertainty for men in this case?
Well, I would go a step earlier than that. So I would say that you have to understand Darwin's theory of sexual selection. So that's really critical, and that's, so we're talking 1871, and sexual selection theory basically deals with the evolution of characteristics because of the mating advantage rather than the survival advantage that it gives organisms, and it occurs through two causal processes. One is intrasexual or same-sex competition, And so we've all seen those nature shows of two stags locking horns in combat, battling it out, and then the winner gets sex with the female, and the loser ambles off with a broken antler and without any access to females. And so the logic is whatever qualities lead to success in these same-sex battles, those qualities get passed on in greater numbers. So you have evolution, which is change over time, an increase in frequency of qualities linked with success and competition. So they could be strength, they could be athleticism, they could be size, but they also could be other sorts of things. So like in our species, we compete for positions in status hierarchies, and so we don't necessarily engage in physical combat, but the same logic applies. And that's one. So that's same-sex competition, and then the other one that Darwin discovered was preferential mate choice. And so the logic there is, if members of one sex have some consensus or some agreement about the qualities they desire in members of the opposite sex, then those who have those desired qualities, they have a mating advantage. They get chosen, and those lacking the desired qualities get excluded from mating. And so again, you see change over time as a result of preferential mate choice. And in our species, so a lot of my research program has been spent unpacking the logic of how humans, I focus only on humans, but of course I'm very familiar with the mating strategies of all other species, or a lot of other species, is how do humans compete for mates? What are our strategies of mate competition? And also, what are our mate preferences? And then I break it down further into short-term mating and long-term mating, because that seems to be a very important dimension. But anyway, so this is all Darwin, 1871, and then your point is a good one, which is 101 years later, in 1972, Robert Trivers comes along and asks the question, what determines which sex does the competing and which sex does the choosing? And his answer to that was parental investment. So in our species, women have that 9-month pregnancy with internal fertilization, and then which is very metabolically costly, in order to produce that one child. And men just have to engage in, at a minimum, one act of sex. Now, typically, men do more than the minimum. Fortunately for women, I think. But this minimum investment, what that means is that the benefits of being very choosy are much higher for the high investing sex, and also the costs, the downsides of making a bad mate choice are more costly, in this case for women. But what's cool about Trivers' theory is it's a theory not about males and females per se, it's a theory about relative investment. And this is where it becomes really interesting applying that theory to our species, because what we have, even though there's this large sex difference in minimum investment, in long-term mating, both men and women typically invest very heavily. And so according to Trivers' theory, what you predict is if both sexes are investing heavily, although in somewhat different ways, both sexes should be very choosy, and both sexes should be competing with each other for access to the high-quality members of the opposite sex. And that's basically what we find is in long-term mating, men are very choosy, just as women are very choosy, and they compete a lot with each other for desirable mates. But in short-term mating, where the investment by the man is very low, what we find is that women continue to be choosy because of the cost if she were to get pregnant. Not that they're thinking about this consciously. And for men basically drop their standards, and they to embarrassing levels, and they're basically willing to mate with many females if the risks are low and the commitment and investment are low. And so these are very important theories. I would mention one other one that I'm focusing on now in my research, which is sexual conflict theory. which is partly related to this issue of parental investment, but deals with the fact that there's really been a dramatic change in how evolutionists think about cooperation and conflict in mating, where it used to be believed that males and females were basically cooperative breeders. That is, they have a joint interest in producing offspring. They have a mutual shared stake in those offspring. And so they thought, well, mating is a very cooperative enterprise, but it turns out that it's not. That there is cooperation, but there's also conflict, and there's conflict over the frequency of sex, the timing of sex, the conflict over extra pair sex partners, so infidelity, cheating. There's conflict over parental investment, so it's advantageous. And this is I shouldn't. This is maybe too depressing for some of your listeners, but it can be advantageous to manipulate or influence your partner to invest more in offspring, in your joint offspring, because that frees up your effort to solve other adaptive problems, like additional mating opportunities or devoting time to increasing your status so that you will be more attractive to other potential mates. So there's a lot of conflict between the sexes. It's the focus of my new book, right? By the way, I'm writing a new book on sexual conflict and sexual exploitation. And so it's a very rich vein, and of course is in the news all the time now, because you have the Me Too movement. I don't know if that's hit Portugal yet. Has that hit Portugal?
Very little, I think.
Very little?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fortunately, I think.
Yeah. So far, my
Yeah.
prediction is it will. Sometimes these trends start out in one country and then erupt in other countries. So, but at any rate, so those are some basic things. But as you said, so most of my research, I've been studying human mating strategies for a long time, and I've tried to get away from them because I never set out to say, okay, I'm going to just study mating strategies in my life. I started out as a more general psychologist, interested in all aspects of human nature. But what I found is that even when I venture into other areas, so I studied murder, homicide for a while, and I thought I'll get away from mating, study murder. Well, it turns out most murder is related to mating in one way or another, either directly through, sexual rivalries or mate homicide, or rivalry over resources or status, which of course is critical for attracting mates. And so, and then now I'm also studying status hierarchies intensely, and those turn out to be very closely related to mating. So it's you can run, but you can't hide from mating. Everything seems to be related to mating in one way or another. Crime, politics, even friendships.
Yes, yes. You refer now to friendships, and I already have people like, for example, Dr. April Blesky-Rishek on the show, and we talked precisely about that. And by the way, at a certain point there, you referred to the fact that you were a bit worried that my audience might get a bit depressed with some of the stuff that you talk about, but you don't have to worry about that because they are already used to it. I've even released
Okay.
an interview with Dr. Randy Thornhill on rape, so it can't get worse than that, I think.
Okay. All right.
Okay,
So
so let's now talk a little bit about the main findings in terms of mate preferences for men and women. So the sex differences in terms of mate preferences, because you did this very interesting study that you published in the 90s where you got data from across 37 different cultures, right?
right.
And so these things occur cross culturally, and that means that they have a very deep biological basis, correct?
Yes. Well, it doesn't. They don't necessarily have to have a biological basis if they're cross-cultural, but it certainly tends to point that way. So, I mean, you could have things spread culturally. So, for example, the invention of fire, it could be invented in one place and then it spreads because other people find it useful. And as far as I know we may have adaptations for fire, but as far as I know, we don't. We don't, or at least there's no strong evidence that we do. I mean, if you were to take any one of us and plunk us out in the middle of a forest with no tools and no lighters or matches, we would have a hard time lighting a fire. But at any rate, yeah. So that was actually the first large-scale study that I did, and in that study we focused on long-term mate preferences, and that's a critical distinction because mate preferences shift as a function of whether you're going for short-term or long-term. But in long-term, what we found is two clusters of sex differences, and then also one cluster of similarities, similar preference. So starting with the similar, both sexes, men and women, wanted mates who were kind, understanding, intelligent, healthy, dependable, and emotionally stable. Although there were some cultures that showed sex differences in some of those. So, for example, in intelligence, where there was a sex difference, women tended to place slightly higher priority on an intelligent mate. But by and large, there weren't many sex differences there. Where we did find sex differences were in two clusters, and these were precisely the clusters that were predicted in advance by our evolutionary hypotheses. One was what women preferred, namely resources and financial resources, as well as the qualities that tend to lead to resources over time. So, is the guy ambitious? Is he industrious? Is he a hard worker? These are things that lead to resources over time and are good. Often when people mate, they're not necessarily at the final point in their resource acquisition. And so, for example, in college undergraduates, I mean, I've spent my whole life in academic settings, so I'm very familiar with the undergraduates. They don't have a lot of money, but they are attracted to people who are on good resource trajectories in the future. So, is the guy a pre-med? Is he pre-law? Does he have plans to start his own business? Is he an entrepreneur? So that's what women preferred more than men, and those were largely universal across. So you go to Zimbabwe or Brazil, or I don't think we had Portugal in the sample in that 37 culture sample. I tried to get Portugal, but I don't think that I was successful in that. It was one of the few cultures that I didn't have. I think Portugal and Switzerland were two cultures that for some reason I was unable to get. And now it would be very easy to get. See, this was all pre-internet days. Now I'd be able to just contact people at Portuguese universities and just say, hey, let's collaborate. And I think there have been subsequent studies in Portugal that have verified these sex differences. So the other cluster, though, what did men value more than women universally? Well, physical attractiveness, good looks, and importantly, relative youth. So men universally wanted women who were younger than they were, and this varied as a function of both the age of the participant and the mating system. So in polygynous mating systems, like I think we had Zimbabwe and a couple, and the Zulu tribe in South Africa, which are both polygynous. So men are legally permitted to take on multiple wives, but they're typically older before they're in a resource position to attract wives. And so in polygynous mating, men tend to get married later. And we know as men get older, they prefer women who are increasingly younger than they are. Doug Kenrick has documented that, and I've documented that as well. So youth and beauty, which are cues to fertility, and sort of along these lines. So anyway, so those are the key mate preferences that we found in that original 37 culture study, and they've now been subsequently replicated in dozens and dozens of cultures, including traditional hunter-gatherer cultures and so forth. And so that made a pretty big splash, and it was also gave me the confidence that I was onto something important. If I had found the results, by the way, surprised me. I didn't expect them to be as universal as they were, and they also see. Before I did the 37 culture study, I asked my colleagues to make predictions about what I would find, and every one of them, with one exception, predicted that these sex differences would not be universal because they thought, well, so I talked to sociologists, I talked to anthropologists, et cetera, and they said, oh no, these are products of capitalism. They're products of Western culture, and unfortunately, I made a mistake of not getting them to write down their prediction and sign their name to it, because after I published the study, everyone said, oh, I could have told you that. But they didn't beforehand. They couldn't predict it beforehand and hadn't been discovered beforehand. And so that was the start of it. And then that led to the next step, which was, well, what about short-term mating? Because we don't just do long-term mating. We also have short-term mating. We have infidelity. And so we looked at mate preferences in that. And so I did this with my then student, who's now become very well known himself, David Schmidt. April Blesky, by the way, she was my student as well. I don't know if she mentioned that.
Yes.
But although the opposite sex friendship, she deserves total credit for that. She came up with those original ideas. But with David Schmidt, we did, well, what do people want in short-term mating? What are their mate preferences there, and how do they differ for men and women, and how do they differ from long-term mate preferences? And what we find is that women increase the importance they attach to physical appearance in short-term mating, increase the importance they attach to masculine qualities, and also increase the importance they attach to desirability to other women. So kind of like, do other women view this guy as hot? And then for men also, and then for both sexes in short-term mating, things like commitment and willingness to invest in children and so forth are not terribly important. It's not surprising. But what we find is that men elevate the importance they attach to physical attractiveness in short-term mating. So it's more important. Attractiveness is important in long term, but it's even more important in short term. But they're willing to relax their standards across a variety of aspects. So for a long-term mate, men want an intelligent partner. So women have to be, at least in our samples, in the 70th percentile in intelligence for a long-term partner. But and for women, that's true as well, 70%. And then women drop slightly in short term. So they drop to about the 60th percentile. The man has to be at least 65th percentile in intelligence. But for men, in short term, they drop to about the 40th percentile. Intelligence doesn't matter at all to them. I mean, is the woman attractive? Is she available? Can I have sex with her with very little effort and without risking my life with a jealous husband or an angry father?
Mhm. Yes, very interesting. And I guess that human mating is not just about us looking for new mates, it's also about retaining the mates that we already have with us. So, could you please tell us about some of the mate retention tactics that men and women use, and perhaps connect that with the emotion of jealousy?
Sure. Okay, so I've written a lot about that, and my first foray into that actually has kind of an interesting history. You mentioned Randy Thornhill. When I was, okay, this is early on in my career, I read a book by Randy Thornhill and John Alcock called The Evolution of Insect Mating Systems. And they didn't deal with humans at all. But they had this section on what was called mate guarding. in insects. And what they found is that male insects do all these things to guard the female. So they grab the female and then take her away from the other males, or they will emit chemical scents that mask the sexual attractant signals of the female, or they'll physically guard her. So they do all these things, and they'll conceal her from other males. And so as I'm reading this about insects, I connected to humans, and I thought, I know humans do a lot of those same things. And so that led me to launch the first set of studies that anyone had ever done on what humans do to retain their mates. And so even though in the insect literature they called it mate guarding, I expanded it a little to call it mate retention, because in long-term mating it's not just about guarding, it's also about retaining, and that could be by providing resources, and other things. So in the studies of mate retention, what we found is 19 different tactics that I published a paper called "From Vigilance to Violence," and so men and women in long-term mating do mate retention, but we find some sex differences there that parallel the sex differences that we find in the mate preference literature, as you would predict. So in other words, one way that men retain their mates is by providing them with resources. So gifts, taking them out to dinner, buying them anniversary presents, and gift giving, and resource provisioning is a very important mate retention tactic, and men do that more than women. Women, in contrast, do more appearance enhancement. So they devote a lot of effort to maintaining or increasing their physical attractiveness as a mate retention tactic. And then we also found some interesting predictors of the intensity of mate retention. So one way to think about this is we have finite, limited time budgets, finite, limited resource budgets. So at every moment, we're making decisions about what adaptive problems do we need to devote effort to solving. And so you don't want to over invest, so to speak. If let's say you're in a hunter-gatherer and you kill a large game animal, well, you don't want to spend the rest of the week going out and killing 5 more, because without refrigeration, it's going to rot anyway. So once you solve the problem, you move on to other problems. And so what we were interested in is, well, what influences how much effort people will allocate to retaining their mate? And what we found is that predictors, men married to physically attractive and younger women devote more time and effort to retaining them, and women married to men who have higher incomes, higher salaries, and who are also high in status striving, those women devote more effort to retaining their mates. So those were some of the cool findings, and now other people, we and other people have explored other aspects of mate retention, such as intimate partner violence. What are the predictors of intimate partner violence? And what Daly and Wilson had predicted, and it's partially borne out, is that men who lack the resources to benefit the woman or retain her through benefit sometimes will inflict costs on her as a strategy of mate retention. So they will threaten her, if you ever leave me, I will hunt you down. Some threaten murder. And so that's one finding. It's not always true. So there are some men who have resources that also engage in violence toward their partners, but men lacking resources don't have that other strategy of providing benefits to keep them. So the mate retention work has kind of led into also some things like stalking and intimate partner violence, which we've explored as well. Now, jealousy, you mentioned jealousy. I wrote a whole book on jealousy and have done some studies. The book is called The Dangerous Passion, if anyone's interested. And it was translated into Portuguese. So I don't know if you were aware of that. I think it was originally um, published in Portuguese in Brazil, and so I don't know.
Well, I read everything in English, so
Oh,
I
okay.
don't even know.
Okay. So that's okay. So translation might be irrelevant. And what about your listeners? Do they read books in English as well, or some in
I
Portuguese?
think
Some.
I think that most of them do. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well,
Yeah,
that's
because I think that they don't want to be waiting for the Portuguese version of the books. Yeah.
oh, okay.
So.
Okay. Well, that's fantastic. So jealousy. There's a lot to say about jealousy, and so maybe I'll just say a few things, and then you can ask me questions about if you would like me to elaborate on anything. So what we had hypothesized, and this actually goes back to Don Simons in his book, The Evolution of Human Sexuality, who is a key figure, by the way. That book was very influential in my research on human mating strategies. I think Don Simons, it's 1979, but that book is just an absolute classic, and some people regard that as the first major treatise on evolutionary psychology, and certainly the first major treatise applying evolutionary thinking to human mating strategies. Uh, but at any rate, Don Simons talked about jealousy as an adaptation, mostly in males. He talked about it as even an obligate adaptation. But the way I think about it is this: is you have this very powerful emotion and called jealousy. And most people, when they think about it, and most of the writing, most of the non-evolutionary writing about it, basically has viewed jealousy as a insecurity, a neurosis, a pathology, some character defect with the person, and viewed as an immature emotion. But what Don and then subsequently Martin Daly, Margot Wilson, and then me um, hypothesized was that jealousy is an adaptation that comes online when you're facing an adaptive problem of either infidelity on the part of the partner or defection. That is, your partner leaving you, leaving the relationship, perhaps for someone else. And so this emotion comes online very predictably. There are sex differences in the triggers of the emotion. So men in general tend to focus more intensely on the sexual aspects of infidelity, of a partner's infidelity, because it is this. If a partner has sex with someone else, that is the act that jeopardizes his paternity certainty. You mentioned paternity uncertainty at the very beginning, and that's really critical because in human reproductive biology, fertilization occurs internally within the woman, and so women are always 100% certain in their maternity. They know, as far as I know, no woman has ever given birth and wondered as the child is coming out of her body, gee, is this kid my own? They know it's their own. Men can never be sure. So some cultures use the phrase mama's baby, papa's maybe to kind of capture this asymmetry between the sexes. And so that's the hypothesis about why men focus so much on the sexual aspects of the infidelity, uh, whereas women tend to focus more on the emotional aspects. So, one of the first questions women ask when they discover their partner has an affair is do you love her? You know, how attached are you to her? And because it's his emotional involvement that signals the long-term diversion of his resources to another woman and her children. Whereas if he says, oh, I went to a party, it was just I had a little too much to drink and I just fell in bed. It was a one night stand. I don't really care about this woman. She doesn't mean anything to me. I'm in love with you. Women find it easier to forgive the infidelity if that's the case. Men still have a rough time forgiving that one night stand uh, for very good evolutionary reasons. And so so it's an emotion that evolved in both sexes to alert the person to threats to the relationship. either sexual threats or threats to the long-term loss of the relationship. And it comes on very predictably under certain circumstances. So cues to infidelity, and as well as things like mate value discrepancies. So, as a general rule, people tend to mate with people who are similar to themselves in mate value. So the eights mate with the eights, the sixes with the sixes in general, and the fours with the fours. But sometimes there's a discrepancy. Sometimes, maybe a man who's a six might get very lucky and attract a woman who's an eight. Or they start out both eights, and then the man loses his job. And so now he's a six, and she's an eight. And so what we found is that these mate value discrepancies predict jealousy. Typically, the lower mate value partner tends to get more jealous because statistically, when there's a mate value discrepancy, there is a higher probability of infidelity and a higher probability that the higher mate value person will leave the relationship for somebody else. Mm-hmm. So anyway, those are a few things that I could say about jealousy, and there's a lot more to say. I mean, but I'll let you. You're the architect. You're the MC, so I'll let you direct the conversation as you want.
Yeah, sure. And because unfortunately we have limited time today, I would like now to talk about an hypothesis about how people in the modern world behave sexually and in terms of mating strategies, and I would like you to comment on that. That is, so as far as I understand it, the sort of mating strategy that people develop, or the one that they have in their minds most active, depends on the environmental circumstances they're in, and also on the behavior, on the sexual behavior of the people around them. Correct? So would you say that, for example, things that are exclusively modern, like we have nowadays, for example, social media and online pornography, that those sorts of things, and in this case they affect mostly male brains, correct? Pornography, pornography particularly. Would you say that perhaps these things, because they might give an erroneous message to particularly young men, that there are much more sexually available women out there, and that they want to perform sexual acts that are much more diverse because men also like that, things like that might be tweaking our brains into activating more short-term mating strategies?
Yeah, I think that's correct. We do have. Well, I should start out by saying that we don't really know, because these things are relatively recent. That is, internet dating sites where historically humans would have only been encountered maybe a few dozen potential mates in their lifetime. Now with internet dating, you have access to thousands or millions of potential dates. And then, as you say, internet pornography is another very big thing, where there seem to be, thousands of sexually available women, and as you say, who are willing to do all kinds of things and get aroused immediately, with no foreplay or whatever. And so it does, I think, create a somewhat distorted impression, but also leads to pressure on women to perform sexually in ways that men come to expect because they see it in pornography. My prediction is that it leads to lower levels of commitment, and might activate a short-term mating strategy, because you can imagine ancestrally, if all of a sudden there were dozens of attractive sexually available women, it wouldn't make sense to commit to one woman for life, and so it's in a way it's artificial input into our evolved sexual psychology that activates it in these evolutionarily novel ways, but they do affect behavior, as it does even things like being bombarded by through media images, through computers, through movies and magazines, thousands of images of these physically attractive people. And there's some evidence that that might cause men to be less attracted to their regular partner or less committed to their regular partner. But I think, I mean, in a way, we live in a fascinating new world, where in some countries, almost all mating uh, occurs on the internet, or at least the initial, encounters occur. So for example, I'm doing some work in China, and in China, it's almost exclusively internet dating. And so it's just been, even in the last 5 years, there's been a dramatic rise in internet dating. And 20 years ago, there was a stigma attached to it, where the only people who did things like internet dating, or before there was the internet, they had like newspaper advertisements of the personals columns, where people would say, "Hi, I'm a 25-year-old male looking for an attractive, intelligent, personable woman." Uh, uh, Back then, there was a stigma attached to those things. It was basically only people who had trouble finding mates did that. But now it's so common, everybody does it, and there's no stigma attached to it anymore. So anyway, it is a fascinating new world we live in, and who knows where it's going to go. Another one that's coming down the pike is sex robots. So as sex robots get and virtual reality sex. So if those get to the point where you can have these fantastic sexual experiences um, without having to go through all the trouble of anything else, what's going to happen? I mean, or I mean, so there's it opens up a fascinating set of questions. Like, what about men who have tremendous difficulty attracting women? Would sex robots be a good thing? Would they maybe reduce rape rates, for example? Unknown. These are unknown things, but the technology is being developed, and being developed relatively rapidly, as is the virtual reality sex. So we have a new set of technologies coming down the pike that's going to influence or interact with our evolved mating psychology.
Yes, and look, you've also been interested in studying sexual morality. So, what is it really about? Is it about, for example, going and looking into, for example, religious sources and legal sources, and see if things that got crystallized in our moral systems derived from these biological bases of what we understand to be, for example, optimized mating and sexual strategies? Is it something like that?
Yeah, it is something like that. So I'm working on this with a former graduate student of mine, Kelly Asau is her name. She's now at the Institute for Social Neuroscience in Melbourne, Australia. And we haven't really published on it yet. And so I don't want to talk about it too much, but just to say that that many people think that our morality is something we acquire from religion, or something we acquire from parents, or acquire from the culture. And what we are finding, and we've now done cross-cultural studies, is that we have evolved moral systems that are not just simply acquired from these external sources during our lifetimes, and that sexual morality in particular is a lot more complicated than most people had realized. It's not one thing. People have morality. The one obvious one that has been studied by Deb Lieberman in particular is incest. So we have an abhorrence of incest, and it's an interesting thing. Well, why should you or I care if someone else in our neighborhood is having sex with his sister? Why should we view that as immoral? But people do. and so there's incest. There's also sexual morality around rape or sexual assault. There's sexual morality around sexual orientation. Large individual differences there, where some view non-heterosexual sexual orientation as immoral, and some view it as just fine. It's not neither moral nor immoral. It's just people's preference. And then also there's atypical sexuality, and what else? I'm blocking on. I think is so sexual infidelity, and then also short-term mating. So some people view short-term mating, casual sex, as immoral, and other people are just fine with that. So what we're finding is we've identified what we call 7 pillars of sexual morality, and indeed, as you implied, we are finding they are related to sexual strategies, and they're even related to people's political orientations, where, for example, people who are on the conservative end of the political spectrum tend to find casual sex more immoral than people on the liberal end of the political spectrum, although there's evidence that people on all sides of the political spectrum engage in short-term mating and also engage in infidelity. So nobody has a monopoly on infidelity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really excited about that work, and I hope it will be out sooner rather than later because I really want to read it. Okay, so
Yeah.
perhaps just one last question because we really have to go here. So we've been talking a lot about how people search for mates, men and women, and the sex differences, and how people retain mates, and the moralistic side of things as well. So, do you think that people could apply this knowledge into improving their own intimate relationships?
Yes, I do. Now, I mean, there are probably limits to how much you can do, but people, uh, there's some things that you can't change, like how tall you are. Although some people try, they wear, platform shoes and so forth. But people can improve on things like their health, their physical fitness, which is also highly valued. And so it's interesting, and people do. It's not that people are oblivious to this. So men tend to, when they exercise, they tend to work on their upper body muscles and develop broader shoulders, which you can do with certain exercises. And women value that broader shoulders relative to hips, that V-shaped torso. Cleanliness and good hygiene are things that are valued by both sexes, and especially by women, though. And so, you can increase your personal hygiene, your grooming, etc. Personality variables can be improved, so people value, people who are industrious, who are hard workers, who are dependable, who are emotionally stable, who are ambitious, and so these are things that you can develop or improve on anyway, at least within certain limits. Yeah, so the short answer is yes. I think also knowledge of what the person you're trying to attract, what do they desire. That's why I called my book The Evolution of Desire. What do people desire is really like the cornerstone of everything, because that predicts what tactics are going to be effective in attracting the people and what tactics are going to be effective in retaining those individuals. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of practical applications from this knowledge.
Mhm. Okay, so Dr. Buss, I won't take any more of your time today, but could you just please tell people where they can find your work online? And by the way, if you already could tell us something about when your new book will be coming out.
Yeah, so the easiest way to find out about my work is just through my website. So it's just my name, davidbuss.com. So if you do a Google search or an internet search for my name, then that will take you to my lab webpage. And then on my lab webpage, I have all the links to all my books. So I think I have 8 or 9 of them at this point, and then also links to all of my scientific articles, which can be downloaded for free. So that's really the best source in terms of the when my next book is coming out. Well, the next book is actually going to be a new edition of my evolutionary psychology textbook. So the 6th edition is now in production, and that will be out in about 5 months or so. So that'll be the next book. The book I'm writing on conflict between the sexes probably will be more like a year and a half. And then I have another one planned after that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Okay, very well. I will be leaving links to that in the description box of this video. So, Dr. Buss, it was really a great pleasure and honor to have you on the show. As I said at the beginning, I've been a great fan of yours. And I guess that we definitely will have to have another conversation in the future because, in fact, I had another 200 million questions that were left unanswered.
yeah. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, it's been wonderful talking with you. You are a terrific interviewer, and I hope your viewers enjoy this conversation.
Oh, they will most certainly. So, okay, thank you again.
Okay, thank you.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and see if you can make a pledge there. I would really be thankful for that. And finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanche, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas and Jim Frank. Thank you a lot for all.